The break room on the third floor smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant. Marcus Reed sat alone at the corner table, the same spot he claimed every day at 11:45, eating a peanut butter sandwich he'd packed that morning while his daughter Lily was still asleep. He was 36 years old, but the lines around his eyes made him look older. His navy blue janitorial uniform was freshly pressed, a small act of dignity in a life that had been stripped of almost everything else. He took a bite and stared at nothing, the way he always did, existing in the comfortable numbness of routine. The door exploded inward with a violence that made him jump. A little girl stood in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. She was maybe 9 or 10 years old, wearing an expensive private school uniform, her dark hair wild around her face. She looked directly at him with eyes that held a terror so pure it stopped his heart. "My dad can't breathe," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, somebody help! He can't breathe!" Marcus was on his feet before his mind caught up to his body. The sandwich hit the floor, his chair clattered backward. "Where?" The word came out sharp, automatic, a voice from another lifetime. "Upstairs!" She was already running, and he was following, his worn work boots pounding against the tile floor. They hit the stairwell at a sprint. She was fast, taking the stairs 2 at a time, and he stayed right behind her, his mind already shifting into a mode he'd buried 6 years ago, a mode he'd sworn he'd never access again. "What happened?" he called up to her as they climbed. "I don't know," she sobbed without slowing down. "He just started making these horrible sounds, and then he fell down, and his face is all puffy and he can't breathe. Please, please, you have to help him." They burst through the door onto the 42nd floor, the executive level. Marcus had only been up here twice before, both times to clean after hours when the powerful people were gone. Now it was the middle of the day, and the girl was leading him past rows of glass-walled offices, past assistants frozen in shock, toward the massive corner office at the end of the hall. The door was wide open. Inside, a small crowd of people in expensive suits stood in a useless semicircle, staring down at the man convulsing on the Persian rug. Richard Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, was dying on his office floor. Marcus saw it all in the 2 seconds it took to cross the threshold. The man's face was swollen grotesquely, his lips blue-tinged and ballooning, his hands clawed at his throat. The wheezing sound coming from his airway was a high-pitched whistle, barely audible, which meant his throat was almost completely closed. His eyes were rolling back. Anaphylaxis, severe, maybe 2 minutes from cardiac arrest. "Call 911!" Marcus barked at the frozen executives as he dropped to his knees beside the dying man. His hands were already moving, checking the carotid pulse, thready, rapid, weakening. "Now!" A woman in a gray suit fumbled for her phone. Marcus's eyes scanned the office with the systematic precision of a trauma assessment. There, on the desk, a glass of something dark, coffee, and beside it, a small bakery box, open, half-eaten pastry inside. His gaze snapped to the trash can near the desk, an empty almond milk carton. "Does he have allergies?" Marcus demanded, looking up at the circle of faces. They stared at him like he was speaking another language. He was the janitor. Why was the janitor touching their boss? "Does he have any known allergies? Answer me." "Tree nuts," the little girl whispered from behind him, her voice small and broken. "He's allergic to tree nuts. He has an EpiPen in his desk, the top right drawer, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't—" Marcus was already moving. He lunged for the desk, yanked open the drawer. Pens, business cards, a tangle of charging cables, no EpiPen. He tore open the next drawer. Files, a stapler, still nothing. Richard Hartwell's breathing had become almost silent. That was worse than the wheezing. That meant there was almost no air moving at all. The third drawer. There. A red and white plastic case with a medical cross on it. Marcus ripped it open, pulled out the epinephrine auto-injector, and tore off the blue safety cap with his teeth. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess. The muscle memory that had been sleeping for 6 years took over like he'd never left the emergency room. He grabbed Richard's thigh, located the vastus lateralis muscle, and drove the needle in through the expensive suit pants with a firm, decisive thrust. The device clicked. He held it there, counting in his head. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000, 5 1,000. He pulled it back and threw it aside, immediately positioning Richard's head to open the airway as much as the swelling would allow. "Come on," Marcus whispered, his fingers on the carotid pulse again. "Come on, come back." The room was silent except for a woman crying softly and the little girl's ragged breathing behind him. 10 seconds passed, 15. Richard's body was still, his face a horrible, swollen mask. Marcus was calculating how long until the ambulance arrived, whether he'd need to start CPR, whether a cricothyrotomy with a pen and a pocket knife was going to be his only option, when Richard's chest suddenly hitched. A wheezing gasp, thin and desperate, but air. Moving air. Another breath, stronger this time. The blue tinge around his lips started to fade, just a shade, barely perceptible, but Marcus saw it. Richard's eyes fluttered, unfocused and confused, but open. His chest began to rise and fall in a stuttering rhythm. The pulse under Marcus's fingers strengthened, steadied. The swelling in his face was still severe, but the immediate crisis, the imminent death, had been pulled back from the edge. Marcus sat back on his heels, his own heart hammering, his hands shaking with an adrenaline dump he hadn't felt in years. He looked down at his palms. They were steady when it mattered, trembling now that it was over. That was normal. That was the way it always happened. What the hell just happened? A man in a charcoal suit, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, was staring at Marcus like he'd just performed a magic trick. "Who are you?" "Janitor," Marcus said, his voice flat. He stood up, suddenly aware of every eye in the room locked on him. "Third-floor custodial." "Janitors don't do that," the man said, his voice filled with suspicion and awe in equal measure. "Where did you learn—" The sound of sirens cut him off, growing louder, close. The paramedics were here. Marcus stepped back from Richard, giving them space to work when they arrived. He looked down at the CEO, who was staring up at him now with confused, grateful eyes, still unable to speak, his throat too swollen, but the look said everything. The little girl pushed past the executives and dropped to her knees beside her father, grabbing his hand. "Daddy," she sobbed. "Daddy, you're okay. He saved you. He saved you." The paramedics burst into the room, a team of 3 with a gurney and equipment bags. Marcus gave them a rapid, concise report in the clipped medical language he hadn't spoken in 6 years. Adult male, approximately 50 years old, anaphylactic reaction, likely tree nut allergen, 0.3 milligrams of epinephrine administered via auto-injector at 11:49. Patient regained partial airway and spontaneous respirations approximately 90 seconds post-administration. He's going to need hospital monitoring, possible secondary reaction. The lead paramedic, a woman with kind eyes, looked at him sharply. "You medical?" "Was," Marcus said. He turned and walked toward the door, needing to leave, needing to get out of this room and away from the staring faces and the questions that were about to come. He'd broken his own rule. He'd stepped back into the world he'd left behind, and now everything felt too bright, too sharp, too real. "Wait!" the silver-haired executive called after him. "We don't even know your name." Marcus didn't turn around. "Doesn't matter," he said, and walked out into the hallway. His legs felt weak. His hands were still shaking. He made it to the stairwell before he had to stop, pressing his back against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He saw her face. He always saw her face when it happened. Sarah, his wife, lying in the hospital bed, her skin pale as paper, her hand limp in his, the alarm screaming, the blood everywhere. The doctors working with the same desperate precision he'd just used on a stranger. But it hadn't mattered. All his training, all his skill, all his knowledge, and he couldn't save her. He couldn't save his own wife. He'd quit the emergency room the day after her funeral. He'd quit medicine entirely. He'd found the most invisible, anonymous job he could find. A job where no one would ever ask him to save anyone ever again. A job where he could just exist, just survive, just get through each day for Lily's sake. But that little girl's face, the terror in her eyes, he couldn't ignore that. He couldn't walk away from that. "Daddy always said you were special." The small voice startled him. He looked up. The girl from the office was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at him. Her face was still pale, but the tears had stopped. "I heard him tell Uncle Philip once that the night janitor had sad eyes but kind hands." He noticed you." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. Richard Hartwell had noticed him. The man who ran a billion-dollar company had noticed the janitor. "Thank you for saving my dad," she whispered. "My name is Isabel. What's yours?" "Marcus," he said quietly. "Thank you, Marcus." She turned and ran back toward her father's office, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Marcus sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settling onto his shoulders. He'd opened a door he'd locked 6 years ago. He'd let the past back in, and he had no idea what was going to happen next. Marcus arrived at work 3 days later, hoping the incident had been forgotten. He clocked in at his usual time, 6 in the evening, collected his cleaning cart from the supply closet, and began his rounds on the second floor. He kept his head down, his movements efficient and invisible, the way he'd perfected over 6 years. He was a ghost again. That was how he needed it to be. But the building felt different now. People he'd never spoken to nodded at him in the hallways. A woman from accounting stopped him near the elevators and said, "You're the one who saved Mr. Hartwell, aren't you?" He mumbled something noncommittal and moved on. By the third floor, 2 more people had approached him. Word had spread. The janitor was suddenly visible, and visibility was dangerous. He was mopping the main corridor when he felt it, that prickling sensation of being watched. He turned and saw her standing near the water fountain, Isabel Hartwell, still in her school uniform, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She'd been waiting for him. "Hi, Marcus," she said, her voice small but determined. "Hi, Isabel." He kept mopping, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. She didn't. "My dad's home from the hospital," she offered, walking alongside him as he worked. "The doctor said if you hadn't given him the medicine when you did, he would have died. They said you saved his life. I'm glad he's okay." Marcus moved to the next section of floor, the mop making wet swishing sounds against the tile. "He wants to thank you. Properly. He keeps asking about you." Marcus stopped mopping. He looked down at this little girl who had somehow decided he was worth her trust, worth her time. She reminded him of Lily, that same stubborn loyalty, that same inability to let things go. "Tell your dad he doesn't need to thank me," Marcus said gently. "I just did what anyone would do." "But you're not just anyone," Isabel said, her eyes too wise for a 9-year-old. "You knew exactly what to do. You saved him like it was easy, like you've done it 100 times before." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her it wasn't easy. It was never easy. Saving someone meant carrying the weight of everyone you couldn't save, and that weight never got lighter. "I have to finish my shift," he said instead, and turned back to his work. Isabel stood there for another moment, then walked away, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. At home that night, Marcus found Lily asleep on the couch, her homework scattered around her, the television playing some cartoon she'd probably stopped watching an hour ago. He turned off the TV, carefully gathered her papers, and carried her to her bedroom. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark curls and his brown eyes. She stirred as he laid her down. "Daddy?" Her voice was sleepy and soft. "I'm here, Firefly." He pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Mrs. Chen said you're a hero. She said you saved somebody's life at work." Marcus closed his eyes. Mrs. Chen was the neighbor who watched Lily after school until he got home. Of course the story had reached her. Of course Lily knew. "It wasn't like that, sweetheart. I just helped someone who was sick." "Mommy would be proud of you." Lily's eyes were already closing again, drifting back toward sleep. "She always said you had magic hands." The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah used to say that. She'd say it when he came home from a shift, exhausted, telling her about the lives he'd held together with nothing but training and will. "Magic hands," she'd whisper, kissing his palms. "My hero with magic hands." But his hands hadn't been magic enough when it mattered most. "Go to sleep, Lily," he whispered, and left the room before his daughter could see the tears in his eyes. Richard Hartwell sat in his home office, his throat still sore, his face still slightly swollen, staring at the file his head of security had compiled. It had taken 2 days of digging, but they'd finally found him. Marcus Reed, age 36, employed as a custodial worker at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals for 6 years. Before that, a gaping hole in his employment history. But before the hole, a different man entirely. Marcus Andrew Reed, registered nurse, emergency medicine specialist, St. Catherine's Hospital, trauma unit. 14 years of service, commendations for excellence, awards for life-saving interventions, a stellar record, the kind of career most medical professionals spent their whole lives building. And then, abruptly, it ended. Resignation submitted. With no explanation 6 years ago. Richard kept reading. Marriage certificate, Marcus Reed and Sarah Elizabeth Chen, married 12 years ago. Then, a death certificate. Sarah Elizabeth Reed died during childbirth at St. Catherine's Hospital 6 years and 2 months ago. Cause of death, postpartum hemorrhage, complications from emergency cesarean section, survived by husband Marcus Reed and daughter Lily Chen Reed. Richard closed the file and sat back in his chair, a profound sadness settling over him. He understood now. The sad eyes Isabel had mentioned. The way Marcus had looked when he'd walked away from the office that day, like a man escaping a crime scene. He'd been running from his past, hiding in plain sight, and Richard had inadvertently dragged him back into the light. He picked up his phone and called his executive assistant. "Derek, I need you to arrange a meeting with Marcus Reed from Custodial. Tomorrow, if possible. Private, just him and me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The janitor?" Derek's voice held a note of something Richard couldn't quite place. Disdain, maybe, or resentment. "Yes, Derek. The janitor who saved my life." "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. I'll arrange it." The line went dead. Derek Shaw stood in his pristine office on the 41st floor, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped his phone. The janitor. 3 days ago, Derek had been Richard Hartwell's right hand, the man everyone knew would eventually move up when Richard retired. He'd spent 8 years cultivating that position, 8 years of 80-hour weeks in strategic alliances and carefully managed appearances. And now, everyone was talking about the janitor, the miracle worker, the hero who'd saved the CEO's life with his bare hands. Richard's gratitude was becoming an obsession. He'd already asked Derek to pull personnel files, to find out everything about Marcus Reed, to set up a meeting. It was all anyone in the executive suite could talk about. Who was this mysterious custodian? What was his story? Derek didn't like mysteries he couldn't control, and he especially didn't like when someone else became the center of Richard Hartwell's attention. That attention was supposed to be his. He made a call to an old friend in HR. "I need you to do something for me," Derek said, his voice low. "That janitor, Marcus Reed, I want you to review his file. Check his background check again. See if there's anything we missed, anything that might be concerning." "Like what?" the woman on the other end asked. "I don't know. That's why I need you to look. Just be thorough. We can't be too careful, especially with someone who now has access to the executive floor, to Mr. Hartwell's private office." It was a seed, carefully planted, nothing overtly malicious, just a hint of suspicion, a suggestion of caution. Derek was very good at planting seeds. The meeting was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon in Richard's private conference room. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early, still wearing his work uniform, his hands scrubbed clean but stained with the persistent evidence of manual labor. He stood outside the door, every instinct screaming at him to turn around and walk away. But he owed Richard Hartwell this much. The man wanted to thank him. Marcus could endure that. Richard was already inside, standing by the window, his back to the door. He turned when Marcus entered, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Richard looked different outside of the crisis, older, more human. The swelling in his face had gone down, but there were still faint shadows under his eyes, the lingering evidence of his brush with death. "Mr. Reed," Richard said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Marcus shook it. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm glad you're recovering." "Because of you," Richard gestured to a chair, and they both sat. "I want to thank you properly for what you did. You saved my life. There's no other way to say it. If you hadn't been there, if Isabel hadn't found you, I'd be dead." "Anyone with medical training would have done the same thing," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. "But you're not just anyone with medical training, are you?" Richard opened a folder on the table between them. Marcus recognized his own personnel file. His stomach dropped. "I had my security team look into your background. I hope you don't mind, but I needed to know who I was dealing with, who I owed my life to." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. His past was no longer hidden. 14 years as an ER nurse, Richard continued, his voice gentle. Decorated. Respected. By all accounts, brilliant at your job, and then you walked away from it all. 6 years ago, you just stopped. I had my reasons. Marcus's voice was tight. Your wife. It wasn't a question. Richard's eyes held a deep empathy that Marcus found almost unbearable. She died in childbirth, at the same hospital where you worked. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I can't imagine that pain. Marcus looked down at his hands. The same hands that had saved Richard Hartwell's life. The same hands that had held Sarah's as she bled out on the delivery table. The same hands that had cut the cord when they pulled Lily from her mother's dying body. Magic hands, Sarah had called them. But magic wasn't real. Magic couldn't stop hemorrhaging. Magic couldn't bring back the dead. I couldn't do it anymore, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. After Sarah died, I couldn't go back into that emergency room. I couldn't stand there and save strangers' lives when I couldn't save hers, when I couldn't save the one person who mattered most. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Richard was quiet for a long moment. You had a daughter to raise, Richard finally said. Lily. She's 7 now. Isabel is 9. I lost my wife 3 years ago. Car accident. She was driving home from a charity event. Richard's voice cracked slightly. I know what it's like to be the parent who survives, Marcus. I know what it's like to look at your child and see the ghost of the person you lost. Marcus looked up, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time. There was an understanding there, a shared grief that needed no further explanation. They were both widowers, both single fathers, both men trying to build lives on the ruins of their broken hearts. Why did you become a janitor? Richard asked. You could have gone anywhere, done anything. Why here? Because it's invisible, Marcus said simply. No one notices the janitor. No one asks the janitor to save them. I could just exist. I could just be Lily's father and nothing more. That was all I had left in me. And yet, when Isabel came running, you didn't hesitate. Marcus thought about that. It was true. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't thought about his own pain, his own fear. He'd just acted. Maybe some things were deeper than grief. Maybe some instincts couldn't be buried, no matter how hard you tried. Your daughter needed help, Marcus said. I couldn't ignore that. Richard smiled, a sad, knowing smile. You're a better man than you give yourself credit for, Marcus Reed. I'm just a janitor, Mr. Hartwell. No, Richard said firmly, you're not. And I think it's time you stopped hiding. Marcus left the conference room feeling exposed, like a nerve scraped raw. Richard Hartwell's words echoed in his mind. It's time you stopped hiding. But hiding was survival. Hiding kept him safe from the memories, from the expectations, from the weight of other people's lives in his hands. He wasn't ready to stop hiding. He didn't know if he'd ever be ready. The next morning, a letter arrived at his apartment. Thick, expensive paper in a cream-colored envelope with the Hartwell Pharmaceuticals logo embossed in gold. Marcus opened it at his kitchen table while Lily ate cereal across from him, her legs swinging beneath her chair. Inside was a check. Marcus stared at the number, his brain struggling to process the zeros. $50,000. A note in Richard's handwriting was clipped to it. For saving my life. For giving Isabel her father back. Please accept this with my deepest gratitude. Marcus folded the check and put it back in the envelope. He wouldn't cash it. He couldn't. Taking money for what he'd done felt wrong, like putting a price on a human life. He'd saved Richard because it was the right thing to do, because Isabel's terrified face had left him no choice. Not for money. Never for money. He wrote a polite note declining the gift and left it on Richard's desk that night during his shift. 2 days later, another envelope appeared under his apartment door. This one contained no check, just a handwritten letter on Richard's personal stationery. Marcus, I understand why you won't take the money. I respect that. But I owe you a debt I can never truly repay, and I'd like to try in a different way. Isabel talks about you constantly. She feels safe with you, and that means everything to me. She's asked if she can meet your daughter. I think it might be good for both of them. 2 kids who've lost mothers, who understand what that hole feels like. Would you consider bringing Lily to dinner this Saturday? Nothing formal. Just two families sharing a meal. Please say yes. Richard. Marcus read the letter 3 times. Every instinct told him to refuse. Getting closer to Richard Hartwell meant getting closer to the world he'd left behind, to the person he used to be. But then Lily walked into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair a wild nest of curls, and he thought about how lonely she must be, how she only had him, and he was barely holding himself together most days. Maybe she needed a friend who understood. Maybe they both did. He texted Richard's personal number, which had been written at the bottom of the letter. Okay, Saturday. But nothing fancy. Lily doesn't do fancy. The response came immediately. Neither does Isabel. Thank you, Marcus. Saturday evening, Marcus stood on the doorstep of Richard Hartwell's house, holding Lily's hand, fighting the urge to turn around and run. The house was in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looked like a painting and every house looked like a museum. It wasn't a mansion exactly, but it was a world away from their cramped 2-bedroom apartment across town. Daddy, you're squeezing too hard, Lily whispered, and Marcus realized his grip on her hand had tightened. He loosened it, took a breath, and rang the doorbell. Isabel answered the door before the chime had even finished, her face lighting up like Christmas morning. You came, Lily, right? I'm Isabel. Do you like pizza? Dad ordered pizza because I said fancy food is boring. Do you want to see my room? I have a turtle named Sir Reginald. Lily, normally shy around new people, looked up at Marcus with wide, hopeful eyes. He nodded, and the 2 girls disappeared up the stairs in a flurry of giggles and rapid-fire questions, leaving Marcus standing in the foyer feeling utterly out of place. Richard appeared from what looked like the kitchen, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, somehow looking more intimidating without his executive suit. They're going to be best friends by the end of the night, he said with a smile. Come on, the pizza just arrived. I hope you like pepperoni. They ate in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, which made Marcus relax slightly. Richard asked about Lily, about what she liked in school, about how Marcus managed working nights while raising a daughter alone. Marcus found himself talking more than he had in years, the words coming easier than he expected. Richard listened like he actually cared, not just making polite conversation, but genuinely interested. Mrs. Chen, our neighbor, watches her after school, Marcus explained. She's a godsend. I don't know what I'd do without her. Lily goes to her apartment at 3, does her homework, has dinner, and then I pick her up on my way home from work around midnight. She sleeps at Mrs. Chen's place on my work nights. That's a long day for a 7-year-old, Richard said quietly. It's the best I can do. Marcus heard the defensive edge in his own voice and tried to soften it. We make it work. I wasn't judging Marcus. I know how hard it is. After my wife Elena died, I had to restructure my entire life around Isabel. I hired a full-time nanny, cut my work hours, turned down board positions. People thought I was crazy, putting my career second. But she needed me. That mattered more than any deal or any promotion. Marcus studied Richard across the table. Here was a man who could have thrown money at the problem, hired an army of staff to raise his daughter while he built his empire. But he hadn't. He'd chosen to be present. Marcus respected that more than he could say. It's different when you're the only one left, Marcus said. Everything falls on you. Every decision, every mistake. No one to tag in when you're exhausted. No one to tell you you're doing it right. Or that you're doing it wrong, Richard added with a sad smile. Elena used to tell me when I was being too strict or too lenient. She balanced me out. Without her, I feel like I'm constantly guessing. Same. The word came out rougher than Marcus intended. Sarah knew how to make Lily laugh when she was sad. She knew all the right things to say. I'm just stumbling through it, hoping I don't screw her up too badly. You're doing better than you think, Richard said. Lily seems like a wonderful kid. Happy, curious, kind. That doesn't happen by accident. The words settled into Marcus's chest, a small, warm spot in the cold landscape of his self-doubt. Before he could respond, the sound of shrieking laughter erupted from upstairs. Both men smiled. That's a good sound, Richard said. I haven't heard Isabel laugh like that in months. They spent the next 2 hours talking, the conversation flowing easier than Marcus could have imagined. Richard told stories about building his company from nothing, about the risks that paid off and the ones that nearly destroyed him. Marcus, slowly, haltingly, told stories from the emergency room. The lives saved, the impossible cases, the moments of pure medical magic. He hadn't talked about those days in 6 years, and it hurt to remember, but it also felt good, like acknowledging a part of himself he'd tried to amputate. When it was time to leave, Lily clung to Isabel at the door, both girls making elaborate plans for another playdate. Marcus promised they'd figure something out, and Isabel turned to him with that same intense seriousness she'd had when she'd burst into the break room. "Thank you for bringing Lily," she said. "She's my friend now. That means you have to come back." "Okay," Marcus said, and found that he actually meant it, in his office. Monday morning, Derek Shaw reviewed the report with satisfaction. It had taken some careful maneuvering, but he'd finally found his angle. The first aid stations throughout the building were stocked with basic medical supplies, including over-the-counter medications and a few prescription items for emergencies. The inventory was supposed to be tracked and audited monthly, but in practice, no one paid much attention. Until now. Derek had noticed that Station 12, located on the 3rd floor near the custodial supply room, was showing discrepancies. Ibuprofen, antihistamines, and a few low-grade prescription pain medications were missing. Not huge amounts, but enough to be noticeable if someone was looking. And Derek had made sure someone was looking. He'd filed an anonymous report with security, suggesting that someone with access to that floor might be pilfering supplies. He'd been careful not to name Marcus directly, but the implication was clear. Who else worked the 3rd floor overnight? Who else had unrestricted access to every corner of the building? The head of security, a former police detective named Patricia Morales, took these things seriously. Derek knew she'd launch an investigation. She'd check the access logs, review the security footage, interview the custodial staff. And she'd find that Marcus Reed's keycard had been used to access that supply closet dozens of times over the past few months. Because of course it had. He was the janitor. That was his job. But context could be manipulated. Access could look like opportunity. And opportunity could look like guilt, especially when Derek had made sure to plant a few pills in Marcus's locker earlier that morning, hidden in the pocket of his spare work jacket. The phone call came Tuesday afternoon. Patricia Morales appeared at Marcus's apartment, her face professionally neutral, her badge visible on her belt. Marcus had just woken up, having worked until 3 in the morning. Lily was at school. He answered the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, confused and immediately anxious. "Mr. Reed, I'm Patricia Morales, head of security at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals. I need to ask you some questions about inventory discrepancies in the building. May I come in?" Marcus let her in, his heart starting to pound. Inventory discrepancies? He cleaned the building. He didn't touch inventory. He didn't even know what inventory she was talking about. Patricia sat at his kitchen table and laid out the accusation with clinical precision. First aid supplies missing from Station 12, his access logs showing frequent entries to that area, an anonymous tip suggesting he might be involved, and then the final blow, delivered with something that looked like genuine regret in her eyes. "We searched your locker this morning, Mr. Reed. With authorization from your supervisor, we found these." She placed an evidence bag on the table. Inside were 3 pill bottles, prescription painkillers. The labels had been partially torn off, but the contents were clear. Marcus stared at the bag like it was a snake. "Those aren't mine. They were in your locker, in your jacket pocket. I don't know how they got there. I've never stolen anything in my life." His voice was rising, panic clawing up his throat. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Mr. Reed, I understand this is upsetting, but the evidence is concerning. You have medical training. You have access. You have the knowledge to know what these medications are and what they're worth. We need to suspend you pending a full investigation. I'm sorry, but that's protocol." Marcus felt the room tilting. Suspended, investigated, accused of theft, 6 years of keeping his head down, of being invisible, of causing no trouble. And now this. And he knew, with a sick certainty, that someone had done this to him. Someone had planted those pills. Someone wanted him gone. "Who made the anonymous report?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "I can't disclose that information." "It's not anonymous if you know who it is." Patricia stood, her expression sympathetic but unmoved. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. Don't leave town. We'll be in touch. Richard was in a board meeting when his assistant interrupted, handing him a note. Security issue, urgent, regarding Marcus Reed. Richard excused himself and called Patricia immediately. What's going on? He demanded. Patricia laid out the situation, the missing medications, the evidence, the suspension. Richard listened with growing disbelief. This doesn't make sense, Richard said. Marcus is a registered nurse. If he wanted medications, he could write prescriptions. Why would he steal over-the-counter pain pills? Exactly what I thought, Patricia admitted. The whole thing feels off, but the evidence is there. I have to follow protocol. Don't terminate him, not yet. Give me time to look into this. Mr. Hartwell, I understand you feel grateful to him, but it's not about gratitude, Patricia. It's about the fact that this doesn't add up. Something is wrong here. But even as Richard said it, doubt crept in. The evidence was damning. The pills had been in Marcus's locker. His access logs were undeniable. What if Richard's judgment was clouded by the life debt he owed? What if Marcus wasn't who Richard thought he was? Isabel was in her father's office after school, doing homework at the small table by the window, when she heard Derek on the phone in the hallway outside. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice carried. No, it's perfect, Derek was saying, his tone smug and satisfied. The investigation will take at least a week, and by then, the damage will be done. Hartwell might feel obligated to the guy, but he won't keep a thief on staff, especially not one with access to the executive floor. Yes, I planted them myself. It was almost too easy. The janitor's locker doesn't even have a real lock. Isabel's blood ran cold. She sat frozen at the table, her pencil hovering over her math worksheet. Derek had framed Marcus. He'd planted evidence to get him fired, and her father didn't know. Her father thought Marcus might actually be guilty. She waited until Derek's footsteps retreated down the hall, then grabbed her backpack and ran. Isabel burst into her father's office, breathless and wild-eyed, her backpack still hanging from one shoulder. Richard looked up from the contract he was reviewing, immediately alarmed by the panic on his daughter's face. Isabel, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Daddy, it's Marcus. Derek did it. He planted the pills. I heard him on the phone. He said it was easy, that Marcus's locker didn't even have a real lock. He framed him, Daddy. Marcus didn't steal anything. Richard stood, moving around his desk toward her. Slow down, sweetheart. What are you talking about? What did you hear? Before Isabel could answer, Derek appeared in the doorway, his expression smooth and concerned. Is everything all right? I heard shouting. Isabel spun to face him, her small hands balled into fists. You're a liar! You framed Marcus! I heard you on the phone! Derek's face arranged itself into a mask of gentle confusion. Isabel, honey, I think you're confused. You must have misheard something. Adult conversations can sound, I'm not confused. Isabel's voice cracked with frustration. You said you planted the pills yourself. You said his locker didn't have a real lock. You said it was almost too easy. Derek looked at Richard with an expression of pained sympathy. Richard, I think Isabel is upset about her friend being in trouble. It's natural for children to create stories to protect people they care about. She probably heard me on a call about the security protocols, and her imagination filled in the rest. You know how kids are. Richard felt torn. His daughter had never lied to him, but Derek had been his right hand for 8 years. Derek had helped build this company. He'd been there through Elena's death, through the hardest years of Richard's life. Could he really be capable of something this cruel? Isabel, Richard said carefully, are you absolutely certain about what you heard? Tears spilled down Isabel's cheeks. Yes, Daddy, please, you have to believe me. Marcus didn't do it. Derek did. Marcus would never steal anything. You know he wouldn't. You said he was a good man. She's 9 years old, Richard, Derek said softly, his voice full of reasonable concern. She's attached to this man. She's trying to protect him. It's completely understandable, but we can't base an investigation on a child's interpretation of a conversation she overheard out of context. Richard looked between his daughter's desperate face and his assistant's calm rationality. The doubt was a physical weight in his chest. He wanted to believe Isabel. But the evidence against Marcus was concrete. The pills had been real. The access logs didn't lie. We'll discuss this later, Richard finally said, his voice heavy. Isabel, go wait in the outer office. Derek, thank you for your concern. I'll handle this. Isabel's face crumpled. You don't believe me. I didn't say that, sweetheart. I just need to think. She ran from the office, and Richard heard the sound of the outer door slamming. Derek lingered in the doorway, his expression sympathetic. I'm sorry about that, Richard. I know this whole situation with the janitor has been difficult for her. She'll understand when she's older. After Derek left, Richard sat at his desk and put his head in his hands. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Marcus received the termination letter on Thursday morning. It was delivered by courier, official, and final. Effective immediately, his employment with Hartwell Pharmaceuticals was terminated for theft of company property. His final paycheck would be mailed within 14 business days. Security had already collected his building access card and locker key. He was not to return to the premises. He read it twice, standing in his kitchen, the paper trembling in his hands. 6 years. 6 years of showing up on time, doing his job, keeping his head down, and it ended like this. Accused of a crime he didn't commit, branded a thief, and there was nothing he could do about it. No one would believe a janitor over the evidence. No one would believe him over whoever had set him up. He sat down at the table and stared at nothing, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed invisible life collapsing around him. How would he pay rent? How would he feed Lily? How would he explain to his daughter that her father had been fired for stealing? Lily came home from school at 3:15, led in by Mrs. Chen, who gave Marcus a worried look but didn't ask questions. Lily dropped her backpack and immediately knew something was wrong. She had her mother's intuition, that uncanny ability to read his moods. Daddy? What happened? Marcus tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. I lost my job, Firefly. Why? Her voice was small, scared. They think I did something I didn't do. They think I stole some things from work. Lily's eyes went wide with outrage. But you didn't. You would never. Daddy, you're a hero. You saved Mr. Hartwell. You save people. You don't steal things. The fierce loyalty in her voice broke something in Marcus's chest. He pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body trembling against him. I know, baby, I know. But sometimes people don't believe the truth. Sometimes the evidence looks bad even when you're innocent. We have to tell them, Lily insisted, pulling back to look at him. We have to make them understand. Mr. Hartwell will fix it. He's your friend now. He'll believe you. Marcus thought about Richard's conflicted expression when Patricia had first mentioned the investigation. Richard wanted to believe him, but even Richard had doubts. Marcus had. Seen it in his eyes, and why wouldn't he? The evidence was damning. The pills had been in his locker. His access logs were undeniable. From the outside, it looked exactly like guilt. It's not that simple, Lily. Yes, it is. Her voice rose, tears streaming down her face now. You have to fight, Daddy. You have to make them see. You can't just give up. But giving up was what Marcus did. It was how he'd survived the last 6 years. When the pain got too big, when the world demanded too much, he retreated. He accepted. He disappeared. It was easier than fighting. Fighting meant hoping. And hope was the most dangerous thing of all. Richard couldn't sleep Thursday night. He kept replaying Isabel's words, the conviction in her voice, the betrayal in her eyes when he hadn't immediately believed her. She'd barely spoken to him since the incident in his office. She'd eaten dinner in silence, gone to bed early, refused his goodnight kiss. His daughter, who had never shut him out before, was shutting him out now. At 2 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went to his home office. He pulled up the security system remotely, something he rarely did but had access to as CEO. If Isabel was right, if Derek had actually framed Marcus, there would be evidence. Security footage didn't lie. Timestamps didn't lie. He started with the 3rd floor, the day before the anonymous report was filed. He watched hours of footage at double speed, seeing nothing but the usual flow of employees. Marcus pushing his cleaning cart, the hallways empty during night shifts. Then, at 3:47 in the morning, something caught his eye. A figure entering the custodial supply area. Not Marcus. The build was wrong, the gate different. Richard slowed the footage to normal speed and zoomed in. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Derek Shaw, in casual clothes, using a key card to enter the supply room. He emerged 7 minutes later, his hands empty, and walked quickly toward the elevator. Richard's blood went cold. He checked the access logs for that timestamp. Nothing. No entry recorded for Derek Shaw. Someone had scrubbed it from the system, but the video footage stored on a separate server couldn't be altered without leaving traces. Derek hadn't thought to check that. Richard kept digging. He pulled Derek's financial records, something he had access to for all executives under fraud prevention protocols. What he found made his stomach turn. Derek Shaw was drowning in debt, gambling debts, based on the creditors listed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars owed to casinos, offshore betting sites, private lenders with addresses in jurisdictions known for organized crime. He cross-referenced Derek's calendar with the missing medication reports going back 6 months. Every time there was a discrepancy, Derek had been in the building late at night. He'd been stealing the medications himself, selling them to pay down his debts. And when the inventory audits started, getting closer when questions started being asked, he'd needed a scapegoat, someone with medical knowledge, someone with access, someone no one would defend. Marcus Reed, the invisible janitor, the perfect fall guy. Richard's hands shook with a rage he'd rarely felt. Derek had been his friend, his trusted advisor, the man he'd confided in about Elena's death, about his fears for Isabel, about the crushing weight of running a company alone. And Derek had betrayed him, had betrayed Marcus, had betrayed everything Richard thought they'd built together, and worst of all, Richard had doubted Marcus, had doubted his own daughter, had let Derek's smooth words cloud his judgment. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Morales. "I need you at the office in 1 hour. Bring backup. We're making an arrest." Friday morning, Derek Shaw walked into Hartwell Pharmaceuticals at his usual time, 7:30, carrying his usual coffee, prepared for his usual day. He rode the elevator to the 41st floor, nodded to the receptionist, and walked toward his office. Richard was waiting in the hallway, his face carved from stone, Patricia Morales standing beside him with 2 uniformed security officers. "Derek," Richard said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood, "we need to talk." Derek's confident smile faltered. "Of course, Richard. What's this about?" "It's about theft, fraud, evidence tampering, and the systematic destruction of an innocent man's reputation to cover your own crimes." The color drained from Derek's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I have the security footage, Derek. From the night you entered the custodial supply area and planted medication in Marcus Reed's locker. I have your access logs, the ones you tried to scrub from the system. I have your financial records showing $600,000 in gambling debts. I have 6 months of inventory discrepancies that line up perfectly with your late-night visits to the building. I have everything." Derek's mask shattered. The smooth, confident executive vanished, replaced by something desperate and cornered. "You don't understand. Those people, the ones I owe, they were going to kill me. I had no choice. I needed the money, and he's just a janitor, Richard. He's nobody. It wouldn't have even hurt him that much. He could have found another cleaning job anywhere." Richard took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He's not nobody. He's a decorated nurse who saved my life. He's a father raising a daughter alone. He's a better man than you will ever be. And you tried to destroy him to save yourself." Derek's eyes darted toward the elevator, calculating escape. The security officers moved to block his path. "You're done, Derek," Richard said. "Patricia, arrest him." Patricia stepped forward with handcuffs. "Derek Shaw, you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and evidence tampering. You have the right to remain silent." Derek's legs seemed to give out. He sagged against the wall, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and despair. "You're ruining your company for a janitor. Do you know how this will look? How weak this makes you seem, choosing him over me?" "I'm not choosing him over you," Richard said quietly. "I'm choosing what's right over what's convenient. That's called integrity. You should look it up." The officers led Derek away, his protests echoing down the hallway. Richard stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of his failure settling on his shoulders. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. Marcus was sitting on his apartment floor, helping Lily build a tower out of blocks, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Marcus, it's Richard Hartwell. I need to see you. Today? Now, if possible. Please. I owe you an apology." An hour later, Marcus stood in Richard's office for the second time. but everything felt different. Richard looked exhausted, older somehow, his eyes red-rimmed. The moment Marcus walked in, Richard stood and crossed the room. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so deeply sorry, Marcus. You were innocent. Isabel tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I should have believed you. I should have believed her. But I let doubt cloud my judgment, and you paid the price." Marcus stood very still, afraid that if he moved, he'd shatter. "What happened?" Richard told him everything. The security footage, Derek's debts, the planted evidence, the arrest. As he spoke, Marcus felt a strange lightness spreading through his chest. Vindication. The word tasted foreign in his mouth. He'd been cleared. His name was clear. "Derek is in custody," Richard finished. "You'll be fully reinstated with back pay and a formal apology from the company. Your record will be expunged. We'll provide references, anything you need. I know this doesn't erase what happened, but I hope it's a start." "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything again." "You didn't lose anything," Richard said firmly. "You never did. I failed you, Marcus. I let you down. But I want to make it right, not just with an apology, but with action." He took a breath. "I'm creating a new position, Director of Employee Health and Wellness. It would be your job to oversee the health and safety of every person in this building, to create protocols, train staff, build programs, to use your medical knowledge to help people. I want you to take it." Marcus stared at him. "I'm a janitor, Richard. I clean floors. I haven't practiced medicine in 6 years. You saved my life in 60 seconds with nothing but an EpiPen and your training. You're not a janitor, Marcus. You never were. You're a healer who's been hiding, and I'm asking you to stop hiding. This company needs you. I need you. Take the job, please." Marcus thought about Lily's face when she told him to fight. He thought about Sarah's voice in his memory, calling his hands magic. He thought about the 6 years he'd spent being invisible and how exhausting it had been to carry that weight alone. "Okay," Marcus whispered. "Okay, I'll do it." Richard's face broke into a smile, genuine and warm. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right." As Marcus left the office, his hands were shaking, but not with fear, with something else, something that felt almost like hope. Marcus stood in Richard's office the following Monday morning, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt instead of his custodial uniform, feeling like an imposter. The Director of Employee Health and Wellness. The title felt too big, too heavy, like a coat that didn't fit. Richard had given him the weekend to think, to prepare, but Marcus had spent most of it paralyzed with doubt. "I don't know if I can do this," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if someone gets hurt on my watch? What if I freeze up? What if I'm not who you think I am?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know what I've learned in 20 years of running this company? That certainty is an illusion. Every decision I make, every risk I take, I'm terrified I'll get it wrong. But I do it anyway, because doing nothing is worse than trying and failing." "It's different when lives are at stake," Marcus said. "When I couldn't save Sarah, it broke something in me. I don't know if it can be fixed." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Marcus, you didn't fail your wife. You couldn't have saved her. Sometimes tragedy just happens, and it's not anyone's fault. Not the doctor's, not yours, not hers. It's just the cruelty of chance. But you've been punishing yourself for 6 years for something you had no control over." "I had control," Marcus insisted, his throat tight. "I was right there. I'm a trained medical professional. I should have known what to do. You should have what? Performed surgery yourself? Stopped internal bleeding with your bare hands? Marcus, you're not God. You're a man. A brilliant, skilled, compassionate man, but still just a man. And men can't stop death when it's determined to come. But we can fight it. We can push back against it every chance we get. That's what you did for me. That's what you can do for hundreds of people here. Don't let Sarah's death steal your gift from the world. That would be the real tragedy." The words hit Marcus like a physical force. He felt tears burning in his eyes, 6 years of grief and guilt rising up in a wave that threatened to drown him. "I miss her," he choked out. "Every single day I miss her." "I know," Richard said softly. I miss Elena every day too. But they wouldn't want us to stop living, Marcus. They'd want us to keep going, to find purpose, to help people, to honor their memory by being the best versions of ourselves we can be. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Richard stood and walked around the desk, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Take the day. Go somewhere you need to go. Do what you need to do. Come back tomorrow, and we'll start building something good together. Marcus drove to Rosewood Cemetery for the first time in 3 years. He'd avoided it, unable to face the stark reality of Sarah's grave, the permanence of her absence. But now he walked through the iron gates with purpose, carrying the flowers he'd bought at a corner store, white lilies, her favorite. He found her headstone under the old oak tree where they'd scattered some of her ashes, Sarah Elizabeth Reed, beloved wife and mother. The dates carved beneath felt like an accusation. She'd been only 30 years old. They were supposed to have decades together. Marcus knelt in the grass, placing the flowers against the stone. For a long time, he just sat there, feeling the weight of everything he'd never said, everything he'd carried alone for so long. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I've been hiding for 6 years. I'm sorry I've been so lost." He took a shaky breath. "But someone gave me a chance to use what I know again, to help people. And I think maybe I'm ready. I think maybe you'd want me to be ready." The wind moved through the oak leaves above him, a soft rushing sound that felt almost like a response. Marcus closed his eyes and let himself remember not the day she died, but the days she lived. Her laugh, the way she'd dance in the kitchen while making dinner, the way she'd believed in him completely, without reservation. "You have magic hands," she'd always said. "Don't ever forget that." "I won't forget," Marcus whispered. "Not anymore." He drove home feeling lighter, like he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. When he picked up Lily from Mrs. Chen's that evening, he told her about the new job. Her face lit up like the sun. "You're going to be a nurse again?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "Not exactly. I'll be teaching people how to stay safe and healthy at work, making sure everyone knows what to do in an emergency, building programs to help people." "Like a superhero," Lily said seriously, "but for grown-ups at offices." Marcus laughed, a real laugh that felt foreign in his throat. "Yeah, Firefly, something like that." The first 6 months were harder than Marcus expected, and more rewarding than he could have imagined. He threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He conducted a comprehensive safety audit of the entire building, identifying hazards no one had noticed before. He implemented mandatory first aid training for all employees. He installed automated external defibrillators on every floor and trained 50 staff members as emergency responders. He created a wellness program that included mental health resources, stress management workshops, and access to counseling services. He built relationships with local hospitals to ensure employees had the best possible care. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he started to heal. The work gave him purpose. The gratitude from employees who'd been helped by his programs gave him validation. And the friendship with Richard Hartwell gave him something he hadn't had in years, a peer, an equal, someone who understood. They had lunch together most Fridays, usually in Richard's office, talking about their daughters, their work, their lives. Isabel and Lily were now inseparable, spending every weekend together, switching between houses like they had 2 homes instead of 1 each. It was at one of these weekend gatherings that Marcus met Emma Chen, Richard's sister-in-law. She was Elena's younger sister, a pediatrician who'd been traveling for work and had recently moved back to the city. She showed up at Richard's house on a Saturday afternoon in October, carrying a pumpkin pie and wearing a smile that reminded Marcus so much of Sarah it made his chest ache. "You must be Marcus," Emma said, extending her hand. "Richard and Isabel can't stop talking about you. The miracle worker who saved my brother-in-law's life and then revolutionized his company's health programs. No pressure to live up to that reputation or anything." Marcus laughed, shaking her hand. "I'm just doing my job." "He's modest too," Emma said to Richard with mock surprise. "You didn't mention that part." Over the following months, Emma became a regular presence at their gatherings. She and Marcus discovered they shared a love of old movies and terrible puns. She understood the weight of medical work, the impossible choices, the way it changed you. She made him laugh in a way he hadn't laughed in years. And slowly, carefully, something tender began to grow between them. Neither rushed it, neither pushed. But it was there, a quiet possibility blooming in the spaces between friendship and something more. The company's annual health and safety fair fell on a bright Saturday in April, almost exactly 1 year after Marcus had saved Richard's life. The parking lot had been transformed into a festival of health education, with booths offering blood pressure screenings, nutrition counseling, mental health resources, and fitness demonstrations. At the center of it all was Marcus's CPR and first aid training station, where he spent the day teaching employees and their families how to save lives. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a training dummy. A crowd of about 30 people gathered around him when he looked up and saw Lily standing at the edge of the group, her face glowing with pride. Beside her stood Isabel, Richard, and Emma. His family, he realized with a start, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the bonds forged through crisis and healing. The key is depth and rhythm, Marcus explained to the crowd, his hands moving with practiced precision. At least 2 inches deep at a rate of 100 to 120 compressions per minute, and don't stop. Even if your arms are tired, even if you're scared, you keep going until help arrives. Because those compressions are the difference between life and death. A woman in the crowd raised her hand. What if we do it wrong? What if we hurt them? Marcus met her eyes. If someone's heart has stopped, they're already dying. You can't make it worse, but you can make it better. You can give them a chance. And that's all any of us can do in a crisis. Give people a chance. After the demonstration, as people filed toward other booths, Richard took the microphone at the main stage. Can I have everyone's attention, please? We have a special presentation to make. Marcus looked at Richard with confusion, but Richard just smiled and gestured for him to join him on stage. Reluctantly, Marcus climbed the steps. The crowd gathered, hundreds of employees and their families, all watching with curious expressions. 1 year ago, Richard began, his voice carrying across the parking lot. I had a severe allergic reaction in my office. I was dying. My airway was closing. My heart was failing. If my daughter Isabel hadn't found Marcus Reed, if he hadn't acted with the skill and courage he showed that day, I wouldn't be standing here right now. The crowd murmured, many nodding. The story had become company legend by now. But Marcus did more than save my life, Richard continued. He saved this company's soul. He showed us that heroism doesn't come with a title or a corner office, that the most important person in a building might be the one we never notice, that worth isn't measured by salary or status, but by character and compassion. Richard turned to Isabel, who walked onto the stage carrying a plaque. She stood in front of Marcus, her eyes shining. This is for you, Isabel said, her voice clear and strong. For being the man who showed us that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear janitorial uniforms. Sometimes they hide in plain sight. But they're heroes all the same. She handed him the plaque. Marcus looked down at it, his vision blurring with tears. It read, Marcus Reed, Director of Employee Health and Wellness, in recognition of extraordinary service, unwavering compassion, and the courage to use your gifts to save lives. Presented by Hartwell Pharmaceuticals and the grateful employees whose lives you've touched. The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, at Lily jumping up and down with excitement, at Emma dabbing her eyes, at Richard standing beside him with a hand on his shoulder. He thought about the broken man who'd hidden for 6 years, convinced his purpose had died with his wife, and he realized how wrong he'd been. Purpose didn't die. It transformed. It waited. It found you again when you were finally ready to be found. After the presentation, after the fair had ended and the crowds had dispersed, Marcus and Richard stood together in the empty parking lot, watching the sun set over the city. You know, Richard said quietly, you saved my life that day. But you saved so much more than that. You saved this whole company's soul. You reminded us what matters, who matters, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. Marcus shook his head. You saved me too, Richard. You and Isabel. You pulled me out of the darkness. You gave me back my purpose. We saved each other then, Richard said with a smile. That's what friends do. That night, after tucking Lily into bed, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and pulled out the old photo he kept in his wallet. Sarah, young and radiant, holding baby Lily in the hospital, her smile bright enough to light the world. He looked at her face, at the joy in her eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, the memory didn't bring crushing pain. It brought warmth, gratitude, love. I'm okay now, Marcus whispered to the photo, his finger tracing the edge of her smile. I found my way back. I'm using the magic again. I'm helping people. I'm living again, Sarah. I'm finally okay. The photo didn't answer, but in the quiet of his kitchen, Marcus felt something settle into place, a peace he'd thought he'd lost forever. Sarah was gone, but she lived on in Lily's laugh, in the lives Marcus saved, in the purpose he'd reclaimed. And that was enough. That was everything. He placed the photo gently back in his wallet and looked around his small apartment. Tomorrow he'd go to work. He'd teach more people how to save lives. He'd have lunch with Richard. He'd maybe call Emma and ask if she wanted to get coffee. He'd pick up Lily from school and hear about her day. He'd live. Fully, completely, without apology or fear. Because sometimes life breaks you. Sometimes tragedy steals your breath and leaves you gasping in the dark. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're brave enough to accept a second chance, you find your way back to the light. You find purpose again. You find healing. You find that the magic you thought was gone was just sleeping, waiting for the moment when you'd need it most. And Marcus Reed, former janitor, former ghost, now healer and friend and father, and maybe someday something more, had finally found his way home.